December 1775. In the rolling hills of Wiltshire, as America declared independence across the Atlantic, and Britain's global empire trembled with revolutionary fervour, a Catholic nobleman stood before what would become one of England's most magnificent Palladian palaces. Henry Arundell, 8th Baron Arundell of Wardour, watched as hundreds of workmen installed the final pieces of a rotunda staircase so breathtaking that 2.5 centuries later, a renowned designer would call it possibly the best staircase in England, if not the world. But this wasn't merely about architectural triumph. This was an act of defiant faith, a statement of resilience from a family that had lost everything to religious persecution just over a century before. The same family whose ancestral fortress lay in ruins barely 3/4 of a mile away, destroyed during the English Civil War for refusing to renounce Catholicism. Now, on that very estate, they were building a palace that would dwarf their destroyed castle, proclaiming to all of England, "We have not just survived, we have prevailed." This is the story of New Wardour Castle, a house built on the ashes of religious persecution, a monument to Catholic endurance in Protestant England, and an architectural masterpiece that would witness the fall of the British aristocracy, serve as a home for the disabled, shelter generations of schoolgirls, and ultimately transform into one of England's most exclusive residential addresses. To understand how a family could rise from the ruins of civil war to create such magnificence, we must travel back not just decades, but centuries, to a time when practicing Catholicism in England could cost you everything you owned, and often your life. The Arundell family's connection to Wardour stretches back to 1393, when they first acquired the estate. But their true test came in the 17th century, when being Catholic in England meant living as a second-class citizen at best, and facing execution at worst. The family had built old Wardour Castle, a magnificent 6-sided fortress that dominated the Wiltshire landscape. It was there, in May 1643, that the family's faith would be tested in blood and fire. When the English Civil War erupted, the Arundells remained staunchly loyal to King Charles I and to their Catholic faith. Both allegiances would cost them dearly. In 1643, parliamentary forces besieged old Wardour Castle. The siege lasted 5 days before Lady Blanche Arundell, left in command while her husband was away, surrendered on terms that the castle would not be damaged. The parliamentarians broke their word. 2 years later, Royalist forces attempted to retake the castle, and in the ensuing battle, the fortress was devastated. Cannon fire tore through the medieval walls. Explosions ripped apart towers that had stood for centuries. When the smoke cleared, old Wardour Castle was a ruin. The family was financially ruined as well. The Arundells were fined £15,000 by Parliament for their loyalty to the king, an astronomical sum equivalent to approximately £3 million today. They lost estates across England. But more crushing than the financial penalties were the continuing restrictions on Catholics. Even after the restoration of Charles II in 1660, Catholics could not vote, could not hold public office, could not attend universities, and faced constant suspicion from their Protestant neighbours. The Arundells could not even legally celebrate Mass in their own home without risking prosecution. Yet the family endured. Through the late 17th and early 18th centuries, they maintained a low profile, carefully managing what remained of their estates, attending secret Catholic masses in hidden chapel rooms, and slowly, meticulously rebuilding their fortune. By the time Henry Arundell inherited the title as 8th Baron Arundell of Wardour in 1756, the family's financial situation had stabilized. The ruins of old Wardour Castle still stood on their land, a constant reminder of what religious intolerance had cost them. Henry Arundell decided that reminder needed a counterpoint, a statement that the Arundells had not merely survived, but had triumphed over persecution. He would build the finest house in Wiltshire. In 1768, Henry Arundell made a decision that would define his legacy. He would build a new house, not on the ruins of the old castle, but close enough that both structures would be visible to each other, the ruin and the palace in eternal dialogue about past suffering and present glory. For this monumental task, he selected James Paine, one of England's most accomplished architects and a master of the Palladian style that dominated English country house architecture in the mid-18th century. James Paine was at the height of his career when Arundell approached him. Born in 1717, Paine had trained under Thomas Archer and had already designed numerous country houses across England. He was known for his mathematical precision, his understanding of classical proportions, and his ability to create interiors of stunning grandeur. Most importantly, Paine understood how to use architecture to make statements about power, lineage, and cultural sophistication. He had designed Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire, one of the supreme examples of Palladian architecture in Britain, and he would bring that same mastery to Wardour. The Palladian style took its name from Andrea Palladio, the 16th-century Venetian architect whose buildings and writings had revolutionized European architecture. Palladio's work was based on careful study of ancient Roman buildings, and he developed a system of proportions and design principles derived from classical architecture. When these principles reached England in the early 18th century through the writings of Inigo Jones and Lord Burlington, they sparked a revolution in English architecture. Palladian houses rejected the Baroque exuberance popular in continental Europe in favor of mathematical harmony, classical proportions, and restrained elegance. Paine's design for new Wardour Castle embodied these principles perfectly. The house would be built as a perfect square, a plan derived from Palladio's Villa Rotonda in Italy. Each facade would be identical in its proportions, creating perfect symmetry from every angle. The main block would rise through multiple floors, with a rusticated basement providing a strong foundation, a piano nobile or principal floor featuring the grandest rooms, and upper floors for family bedrooms and servants' quarters. Flanking pavilions would extend from the main block, providing additional accommodation and creating a powerful horizontal emphasis that proclaimed the building's dominance over the landscape. But Paine's true masterstroke was the rotunda. In the very center of the house, he designed a circular entrance hall that would rise through all floors of the building, topped by a magnificent domed ceiling. This rotunda would serve as the heart of the house, the space through which all movement flowed, and it would feature a double staircase of such elegance and grandeur that it would become the house's defining feature. The idea of a circular entrance hall was not new. Palladio himself had designed the Villa Rotonda with a central circular hall, but Paine's execution at Wardour would be particularly spectacular, combining classical proportions with luxurious materials and theatrical lighting effects. In 1769, construction began. The location chosen was approximately 3/4 of a mile from old Wardour Castle, positioned on slightly higher ground with commanding views over the surrounding parkland. From the new house, the ruins of the old castle would be visible, deliberately incorporated into the designed landscape as a picturesque feature, a romantic ruin that added historical depth and melancholy beauty to the estate. The construction of new Wardour Castle consumed 7 years, from 1769 to 1776, and required the coordinated efforts of hundreds of craftsmen, labourers, and specialists. The scale of the project was immense by any standard, but particularly remarkable given the remote location in rural Wiltshire, far from major cities and their concentrations of skilled workers and building materials. The first challenge was materials. Paine specified limestone ashlar for the exterior walls, a fine-grained limestone that could be cut into precise blocks and that would weather to a beautiful honey gold colour. This limestone came from local quarries in the region, but extracting, cutting, and transporting thousands of tons of stone required extraordinary organization. Teams of quarrymen worked constantly to supply the building site, cutting blocks to exact specifications provided by Paine's architectural drawings. Each block had to be precisely sized to ensure the perfect proportions Palladian architecture demanded. Inside, the materials became even more exotic and expensive. The rotunda floor would feature black and white marble in geometric patterns, requiring marble to be transported from quarries across England and potentially from Italy. The fireplaces throughout the house would be carved from different coloured marbles, each one a work of art in itself. Wood for flooring, panelling, and decorative elements had to be carefully selected and seasoned. The finest craftsmen in England were recruited to execute Paine's designs. The workforce was enormous. While exact records of the number of workers don't survive, a project of this scale would typically employ between 200 and 400 men at the height of construction. The carved stonework around doors and windows required masons who understood classical architectural vocabulary, the precise forms of different column orders, the proper proportions of pediments and entablatures. The construction process followed a carefully orchestrated sequence. First came the excavation of foundations, dug deep into the Wiltshire soil to provide stable support for the massive weight of the building above. Then the walls began to rise, course by course of precisely cut limestone. As the walls reached each floor level, massive beams were installed to support the floors above. The roof structure, with its complex system of timber framing, was erected and covered with Welsh slate, chosen for its durability and attractive appearance. But the most challenging aspect of construction was the rotunda. Creating a circular interior space within a square building required extraordinary mathematical precision and engineering skill. The rotunda's walls had to be perfectly round, yet they also had to integrate seamlessly with the square exterior walls and with the rectangular rooms surrounding the rotunda on each floor. The double staircase that swept up on either side of the rotunda required careful calculation to ensure each step was identical and that the stairs met perfectly at each landing. The dome that crowned the rotunda presented particular challenges, requiring a complex system of hidden supporting structures to transfer the dome's weight to the walls below while maintaining the illusion of effortless floating. Paine's design specified that the rotunda would be 144 feet in circumference, creating a space of cathedral-like grandeur at the home's center. The ground floor would feature black and white marble in a pattern radiating from a central black and white marble decoration. The walls would be limestone with black insets, creating dramatic visual contrast. At first floor level, Corinthian columns, the most ornate of the classical orders, would support the dome. These columns had to be carved from single blocks of stone or constructed from drums of stone so precisely cut that the joints would be invisible. The dome itself would be coffered, divided into geometric compartments decorated with reliefs of musical instruments, a common motif in 18th-century decorative schemes that symbolized harmony and the arts. At the dome's center, a lantern would admit natural light, transforming the rotunda into a space that seemed to glow with divine radiance. Around the first floor, an iron balustrade with gilded flowers and a wooden handrail would allow circulation around the rotunda's perimeter, creating a viewing gallery from which the full magnificence of the space could be appreciated. The costs were staggering. While exact figures for the construction of New Wardour Castle have not survived, comparable houses from the same period provide guidance. Kedleston Hall, designed by Paine in the 1760s, cost approximately £30,000 to build. Harewood House in Yorkshire, completed in 1771, cost around £90,000. New Wardour Castle, given its scale and the quality of its finishes, likely cost between £40,000 and £60,000, equivalent to approximately £8 to £12 million in today's money when accounting for inflation, though the actual economic equivalent would be far higher given the differences in labour costs and the rarity of skilled craftsmanship. Henry Arundel spared no expense. This was not merely about creating a comfortable home, it was about making a statement. Every visitor who entered the house would immediately understand that the Arundells had recovered from the catastrophe of the Civil War, that despite centuries of persecution, they had not only survived but had prospered, and that they possessed the cultural sophistication to create one of England's finest Palladian houses. When construction concluded in 1776, New Wardour Castle stood as one of the supreme achievements of English Palladian architecture. English Heritage would later describe it as one of the finest Palladian houses in Wiltshire, and that assessment, typically restrained in English Heritage's descriptions, understates the building's magnificence. Approaching the house from the north, visitors would first see the entrance front rising from carefully landscaped grounds. The facade presented perfect symmetry, the mathematical harmony that Palladio had advocated. A rusticated basement, with its rough textured stonework suggesting strength and permanence, supported the piano nobile above. Here, the limestone was smooth and precisely cut, large windows with elegant proportions admitting light to the principal rooms. Above the piano nobile, a mezzanine floor provided additional bedroom accommodation, and at the top, an attic floor housed servants' quarters, discreetly tucked under the roofline. The roof itself was hipped, sloping down on all four sides, and covered with Welsh slate that would weather to a dark grey blue, contrasting beautifully with the honey gold limestone. Flanking pavilions extended from either side of the main block. These were connected to the central block by short corridors, creating a composition that emphasized horizontal extension while maintaining the dominance of the central block. The pavilions provided additional accommodation and services, kitchens, sculleries, storage, and servants' quarters that kept the noise and activity of household work separate from the elegant entertaining spaces in the main house. But the true revelation came upon entering the house. Visitors would pass through the entrance on the north side and suddenly find themselves in the rotunda, and the effect was overwhelming. The space soared upward through all floors of the building, creating a volume so grand it seemed to belong in a palace or cathedral rather than a private house. The black and white marble floor created a dizzying geometric pattern. Limestone walls with black insets provided dramatic contrast. On either side, double staircases swept upward in perfect symmetrical curves, their balustrades fitted with glass candle lamps that would, when lit for evening entertainments, transform the space into a glittering cascade of light. Following the staircases to the first floor, visitors would find themselves on a wooden floor surrounded by Corinthian columns. These columns, with their elaborate capitals decorated with acanthus leaves, supported the ornately coffered dome above. The dome's coffers were decorated with reliefs of musical instruments, cellos, violins, flutes, horns, symbolizing the harmony and culture that the Arundells cultivated. At the dome's center, a glazed lantern admitted natural light that would change throughout the day, creating an ever-shifting atmosphere in the rotunda. The surrounding balustrade was made of fine ironwork, with gilded flowers catching the light, creating points of golden brilliance against the darker iron. Also on the first floor of the rotunda was an organ, positioned to take advantage of the space's exceptional acoustics. The rotunda acted as a natural amplifier, and music played on the organ would fill the entire volume with sound, creating an experience that was simultaneously visual and auditory, a total sensory immersion in beauty and harmony. Moving beyond the rotunda, visitors would find a sequence of staterooms arranged around the house's perimeter. These rooms embodied the principle of the piano nobile, the noble floor where the most important rooms were located. Each room had its own character and decorative scheme, but all shared common features that proclaimed the house's magnificence. Ceilings throughout the principal rooms were painted with elaborate decorative schemes. Some featured mythological scenes, gods and goddesses in classical settings that demonstrated the owner's familiarity with classical literature and culture. Others featured trompe-l'œil effects, painted architecture that created illusions of greater height or additional architectural features, Still others featured abstract decorative patterns in the Rococo style, swirling organic forms and delicate colors that created atmospheres of refined elegance. Fireplaces in each room were works of art, carved from different colored marbles: white, black, red, green. Each fireplace featured classical architectural elements, columns, pediments, carved reliefs. The mantels were designed to be focal points in each room, and portraits or mirrors would typically be hung above them, creating vertical compositions that drew the eye upward toward the painted ceilings. The walls of the principal rooms were treated in various ways. Some featured wood paneling, creating warm, intimate atmospheres suitable for libraries or dining rooms. Others were covered in silk damask or other expensive fabrics, providing rich textures and colors. Still others were painted in fashionable colors of the period, soft greens, blues, and yellows that created elegant backgrounds for furniture and artworks. Windows throughout the piano nobile were large, reflecting Paine's understanding that one of Palladianism's great achievements was the integration of interior and exterior spaces. The windows framed carefully composed views of the parkland, bringing the designed landscape into visual connection with the interior rooms. This wasn't merely about admitting light. It was about creating a relationship between architecture and nature, both subjected to the same ordering principles of classical design. On the upper floors, family bedrooms and guest rooms were arranged around the rotunda, each with views over the parkland. These rooms were less elaborately decorated than the staterooms below, but still featured quality finishes appropriate to a house of this status. Fireplaces in bedrooms were smaller and simpler than those downstairs, but still carved from marble. Ceilings might feature simple molded plasterwork rather than elaborate painted schemes. But comfort was paramount, with generous room sizes and excellent natural light. The attic floor housed servants' quarters. Here, the decoration was plain, whitewashed walls and simple wooden floors. But even the servants at Wardour lived in better conditions than many working-class families in 18th-century England. But new Wardour Castle possessed one feature that made it unique among English Palladian houses: an integral Catholic chapel of extraordinary magnificence. This was the clearest statement of the Arundells' faith and their determination that, despite centuries of persecution, they would worship openly in their own home. The chapel, known as All Saints' Chapel, was part of Paine's original design, integrated into the house's structure. This integration was itself significant. For centuries, English Catholics had worshipped in hidden chapel rooms, disguised spaces that could be quickly cleared if authorities arrived. By placing a chapel prominently within the house's plan, the Arundells were declaring that the age of persecution had ended, that they would no longer hide their faith. The chapel, as originally built by Paine, was already substantial, but in 1789, Henry Arundel, the 8th Baron who had built the house, decided to enlarge it dramatically. For this project, he employed John Soane, one of the most innovative architects of the late 18th century. Soane was just beginning his career. He had been appointed surveyor to the Bank of England only in 1788, but already his distinctive style, characterized by subtle lighting effects and refined classical details, was evident. Soane's addition transformed the chapel into what the architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner would later describe as having the size of a very major parish church and being grand in its decoration. The enlarged chapel could accommodate not just the Arundell family, but also a substantial local Catholic community. Wardour had long been a center of Catholic resistance, and families throughout the area who had maintained their faith through centuries of persecution now had a proper church where they could worship openly. The chapel's interior created an experience of sacred grandeur. At the entrance stood a marble relief of the Virgin and Child, sculpted by P. E. Monod in 1703. This sculpture predated the house itself and had likely been preserved from an earlier chapel or acquired by the Arundells as a devotional object. Its placement at the chapel entrance set the tone. Visitors passed from the secular magnificence of the house into a sacred space marked by this image of divine motherhood. Inside, the chapel's architecture employed the classical language common to the house, but transformed it to sacred purposes. Giant fluted pilasters rose along the walls, their vertical emphasis drawing the eye upward. The ceiling was a groin vault, a structural form borrowed from medieval church architecture, but executed here with 18th-century refinement. This combination of medieval structural forms and classical decorative language created a space that acknowledged the Catholic Church's long history while embracing contemporary aesthetic sophistication. At the west end, Soane added a sanctuary featuring Ionic columns and a domed ceiling with gilded plaster. This dome echoed the great dome of the rotunda, creating a visual connection between the sacred and domestic spaces of the house. The Ionic columns, simpler than the Corinthian columns in the rotunda but still elegant, framed the altar area and created a sense of sacred separation. The altar set apart from the congregation, but still visually integrated through the unifying classical architectural language. The altar itself was designed by Giacomo Quarenghi, an Italian architect who would later become one of the principal architects of St. Petersburg, creating numerous buildings for Catherine the Great. Quarenghi's altar at Wardour was carved from marble and featured classical proportions and refined details that demonstrated his mastery of the form. Behind the altar hung a painting by Giuseppe Card, a Roman artist known for his religious works. The painting depicted a sacred subject, details of which have been lost to historical records, and served as a focal point for worship, drawing the congregation's attention toward the divine. Above the altar, a lunette window contained stained glass by Francis Egerton, one of the finest glass painters of the late 18th century. Egerton's work transformed natural light into colored radiance, creating an atmosphere of sacred mystery. As sunlight passed through the colored glass, it would cast shifting patterns of light across the altar and sanctuary, creating a dynamic visual environment that changed throughout the day and seasons. The chapel's acoustics were exceptional, a quality that would ensure its continued use for musical events centuries later. The groin vaulting and the chapel's proportions created an acoustic environment where music and singing would resonate beautifully, enhancing the liturgy and creating an immersive sensory experience of worship. Pevsner, in his detailed architectural survey of Wiltshire, particularly noted the chapel's important collection of vestments dating from the 15th century onwards. These vestments, the ornate robes worn by priests during Mass, represented an unbroken line of Catholic worship stretching back before the Reformation. That such vestments had survived the centuries of persecution, hidden and preserved by faithful families, and could now be displayed and used openly in the chapel, was itself a testament to Catholic endurance. The chapel served not just the Arundell family, but the entire local Catholic community. From its completion, it held regular Sunday masses, serving what Pevsner described as a substantial local recusant community. The term recusant referred to Catholics who had refused to attend Anglican services, a refusal that had once been punishable by fines and imprisonment. Now, descendants of those recusants could worship freely in a chapel of extraordinary beauty. In the late 1890s, ownership of the chapel was transferred to the Wardour Chapel Trust, ensuring that it would continue to serve the Catholic community regardless of who owned the house itself. This transfer proved prescient, as the 20th century would bring dramatic changes to the estate. Through all subsequent transformations of the house, the chapel would remain a functioning Catholic church, continuing to hold regular masses, a living connection to the faith that had motivated the building's creation. With construction complete in 1776, the Arundells took possession of one of England's finest houses. The timing was auspicious in some ways, inauspicious in others. The house was finished just as the American Revolution reached its climax, as Britain's American colonies declared independence. The world was changing rapidly, old certainties were being questioned, revolutionary ideas about rights and representation were spreading. But within the walls of New Wardour Castle, the Arundells maintained a world of aristocratic tradition, refined culture, and Catholic faith. The household's daily life operated according to strict rhythms established by centuries of aristocratic custom. The family would rise at a genteel hour, breakfast would be served in a dedicated breakfast room, and then the day's activities would unfold according to season and circumstance. During the social season, when the aristocracy gathered in London, the family might travel to the capital, leaving a skeleton staff to maintain the house. But during the summer and autumn, when Parliament was not sitting and the aristocracy dispersed to their country estates, Wardour would come alive. Managing a house of this scale required a substantial staff. While exact records of the Arundells' household staff don't survive, comparable houses from the period typically employed between 30 and 60 servants, and Wardour, with its exceptional size and the additional burden of the chapel, likely fell toward the higher end of that range. The household staff operated within a strict hierarchy. At the top stood the butler, the senior male servant responsible for the dining room, the wine cellar, and the male servants who worked in the house's public spaces. The butler at a house like Wardour would be a figure of considerable authority, managing significant resources and commanding respect from the entire staff. He would have his own sitting room and would take his meals separately from lower servants, marking his elevated status. The housekeeper held equivalent status among female servants. She managed the female staff, oversaw cleaning and maintenance of the house's interior, and controlled the storerooms where household supplies were kept. At Wardour, with its numerous elaborate rooms requiring constant care, the housekeeper's responsibilities were enormous. She would conduct daily inspections, assign tasks to housemaids, and ensure that the house's interiors maintained the pristine condition expected in an aristocratic household. Below these senior servants came a cascade of specialized positions. The cook, presiding over the kitchens in one of the flanking pavilions, would command a staff of kitchen maids and scullery maids preparing elaborate multi-course meals for family and guests. Footmen, young men in livery, would serve at table, carry messages, and attend to various household tasks. Housemaids would clean rooms, make beds, tend fires, and perform the countless tasks necessary to maintain a house of this scale. Ladies' maids would attend to the personal needs of the lady of the house and any daughters, helping them dress, arranging their hair, and maintaining their wardrobes. Valets would perform similar services for the gentlemen. Beyond the house itself, outdoor staff maintained the estate. Gardeners tended the extensive grounds, coachmen and grooms cared for horses and carriages in the stables, and gamekeepers managed the estate's hunting grounds. During harvest season, additional labourers would be employed from the surrounding countryside to bring in crops from the estate's farms. This large staff made possible a lifestyle of refined comfort that seems almost unimaginable today. The family would never carry anything heavy, servants would do that. They would never clean anything, servants would do that. They would never cook, never tend a fire, never harness a horse. Their lives were devoted entirely to leisure, culture, and the management of their estates and social obligations. But this shouldn't be understood as pure idleness. The aristocracy had specific roles to play in 18th century society. They were expected to provide leadership in their localities, serving as magistrates and overseeing local administration. They were expected to patronize the arts, commissioning works from artists, musicians, and architects. They were expected to maintain standards of taste and culture that would trickle down through society. And they were expected to manage their estates responsibly, ensuring the welfare of the tenants and labourers who depended on them. Henry Arundell, as the builder of New Wardour Castle, fulfilled these expectations admirably. His commissioning of the house itself was an act of cultural patronage that employed hundreds of craftsmen and stimulated the local economy. His enlargement of the chapel demonstrated his commitment to his Catholic community, and his management of the estate ensured its continued prosperity, providing the resources necessary to maintain his magnificent house. The true purpose of a house like New Wardour Castle was entertaining. The aristocracy of the 18th and early 19th centuries conducted their social, political, and economic lives through an endless round of visits, dinners, balls, and house parties. A great house was a stage for performance, a setting where social dramas played out, alliances were forged, marriages were arranged, and status was negotiated. Wardour was particularly well suited for entertaining. The rotunda provided a stunning entrance that would immediately impress guests. The sequence of staterooms around the piano nobile allowed for the elaborate choreography of aristocratic entertaining. The chapel added a unique dimension, allowing the Arundells to offer their Catholic guests the opportunity to attend Mass, a significant attraction given the scarcity of Catholic chapels in England. A typical dinner party at Wardour would be an elaborate affair. Invitations would be sent weeks in advance, allowing guests time to arrange their travel. No small matter in an age when even short journeys required hours in carriages on poor roads. Guests would arrive in the late afternoon, their carriages processed through the parkland and deposited them at the entrance. Servants would greet them and show them to their rooms, allocated according to their rank and the degree of intimacy they enjoyed with the family. As evening approached, guests would dress for dinner. This was a complex ritual, especially for women, whose elaborate gowns required assistance from ladies' maids. By the time guests gathered in the drawing room before dinner, they would be dressed in their finest, women in silk gowns with elaborate hairstyles decorated with feathers and jewels, men in embroidered coats and knee breeches. Dinner itself would be served in the dining room at a table that could accommodate dozens of guests. The meal would consist of multiple courses, perhaps beginning with soup, followed by fish, then various meat dishes, game, poultry, and finally desserts and fruits. Wine would flow continuously, selected from the butler's cellar to complement each course. Conversation would range across politics, literature, philosophy, and gossip, all conducted according to strict rules of etiquette that governed who could speak to whom and about what topics. After dinner, the company would retire to other rooms for different activities. Music would be performed either by talented guests or by professional musicians hired for the evening. Card games would be played, often for high stakes. In the library, men might gather to discuss politics while smoking and drinking port. Through all of this, the house itself would be on display, its architectural magnificence, its art collection, its furnishings all contributing to the Arundells' reputation as people of taste and culture. For larger gatherings, balls would be held. The state rooms would be cleared of furniture, creating spaces for dancing. The organ in the rotunda might provide music, its sound filling the entire space. Hundreds of candles would be lit throughout the house, creating a glittering spectacle. Guests would dance formal dances like minuets and country dances, following precise steps that everyone in aristocratic society had learned from childhood. House parties could extend for days or even weeks. Guests would be provided with bedrooms and would settle into a rhythm of lazy mornings, active afternoons spent hunting or walking in the parkland, and evenings of elaborate entertaining. During such extended visits, deep relationships would be forged, business would be discussed, and marriages would be arranged between young people thrown together in this intimate setting. The guest lists at Wardour would have included the leading Catholic families of England, the Howards, the Cliffords, the Petres, families who had maintained their faith through centuries of persecution and now formed a close-knit community within English society. But the Arundells would also have entertained Protestant aristocrats, demonstrating that despite their Catholicism, they were fully integrated into English aristocratic society. Important political figures would have visited Wardour as well. Although Catholics were still excluded from Parliament and most public offices in the late 18th century, they wielded influence through wealth, land ownership, and social connections. The Arundells, as one of the leading Catholic families, would have been courted by politicians seeking Catholic support for various causes. The 19th century brought gradual changes to English Catholic life. Catholic emancipation in 1829 finally granted Catholics the right to vote and hold most public offices, ending centuries of legal discrimination. This should have been a triumph for families like the Arundells. In some ways it was, but it also coincided with larger forces that would ultimately undermine the aristocratic world in which they lived. The Industrial Revolution was transforming England. Wealth increasingly came from factories and commerce rather than land. The aristocracy's political power was being challenged by an emerging middle class. Agricultural depression in the late 19th century reduced the income from estates, and changing social attitudes were making the elaborate hierarchy of aristocratic life seem increasingly anachronistic. The Arundells maintained New Wardour Castle through the 19th century, but the burden of maintaining such an enormous house grew heavier. The introduction of income tax in 1842 meant the government took a share of estate income. The expansion of the franchise gradually reduced the aristocracy's political influence, and the rise of new forms of entertainment, theatres, music halls, sports, meant that aristocratic house parties no longer held the monopoly on elite social life they once had. The 20th century brought even more devastating changes. The First World War killed hundreds of thousands of young British men, including numerous heirs to aristocratic estates. The war also normalized income tax at rates that would have been unthinkable in the 19th century. The introduction of estate duties, death taxes on inherited wealth, made it increasingly difficult to pass great estates intact from one generation to the next. Through all these changes, the Arundells maintained possession of Wardour, a testament to their careful estate management and their attachment to their ancestral home. But by the mid-20th century, the arithmetic of aristocratic life had become impossible. The costs of maintaining a house like New Wardour Castle, with its elaborate interiors requiring constant care, its vast roof needing periodic renewal, its grounds requiring armies of gardeners, exceeded what even a substantial estate could generate in income. The final blow came with the death in 1944 of John Arundell, 16th and last Baron Arundell of Wardour. The title died with him, ending a lineage that stretched back centuries. The estate faced massive death duties. There was no heir willing or able to take on the burden of maintaining the house. The Arundell family's connection to Wardour, which had endured for over 550 years, was coming to an end. In 1946, New Wardour Castle entered a new chapter when it was acquired by the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church. For the Jesuits, Wardour represented an opportunity to establish a presence in a historically significant location. The house's chapel made it particularly suitable for religious use. But the Jesuits struggled to find an appropriate purpose for such an enormous building. It was too large for a simple religious community, but developing it for educational or retreat purposes would require substantial investment. In 1955, the Jesuits made a fateful decision. They licensed the property to the Leonard Cheshire Foundation, a charity established by Group Captain Leonard Cheshire, a highly decorated RAF pilot who had become one of the war's heroes and who devoted his post-war life to caring for disabled people. Cheshire's initial vision was to use Wardour as a home for rehabilitating prisoners, but plans evolved, and it was ultimately designated as a home for disabled people who could not be accepted into other Cheshire homes across Britain, those whose needs were too complex or whose behaviours were too challenging for other facilities. The home officially opened in January 1956 under the wardenship of Colonel Irvine Andrews, a New Zealand military officer who had won the Victoria Cross during World War II. Andrews brought military discipline and organisational skill to the task of running the home, and he demonstrated entrepreneurial creativity by establishing a pig farm on part of the estate's grounds to generate income to support the home's operations. But from the beginning, the project faced enormous challenges. The house's structural condition was poor after years of minimal maintenance. Only a small portion of the building could be renovated for residents to live in, and even this renovation was expensive. The home was limited to just 8 residents, far too few to generate the economies of scale necessary for financial sustainability. The Ministry of Works offered £40,000 to help renovate the property, a substantial sum in 1956, equivalent to approximately £1.2 million today. But the renovation would require at least £60,000 total, and the Leonard Cheshire Foundation's trustees could not commit to raising the additional £20,000 needed. The trustees recognised that even with the renovation complete, the ongoing costs of maintaining such an enormous building would be prohibitive. The same qualities that made New Wardour Castle magnificent as an aristocratic home, its vast scale, its elaborate interiors, its location in rural Wiltshire far from major population centres, made it unsuitable as a care home. In 1961, New Wardour Castle found a new purpose when it became home to Cranborne Chase School, an independent boarding school for girls. The school had been founded elsewhere in 1946 and was seeking larger premises that could accommodate growing enrollment. Wardour offered exactly what the school needed: abundant space for classrooms and dormitories, extensive grounds for outdoor activities, and a location in rural Wiltshire that provided a healthy environment away from urban distractions. The school undertook significant construction to adapt the house for educational use. New classrooms were built, along with studio dormitories where girls could sleep and study. A dining room extension was added to the southeastern side of the main house, providing space for communal meals. 3 staff houses were constructed to the west of the main house, providing accommodation for teachers and administrators. These additions, built in the mid-20th century institutional style, contrasted sharply with Paine's elegant Palladian architecture. But they were functional and allowed the school to operate effectively. Generations of girls passed through Cranborne Chase during its 29 years at Wardour, receiving their education in one of England's most historically and architecturally significant buildings. The school years represented a period of intensive use for the house. Classrooms filled with students, dormitories echoed with the conversations and laughter of teenage girls. The chapel continued to serve its religious function for students and staff, and the grounds became playing fields and recreational areas. In some ways, the house was more fully inhabited during these decades than at any time since the Arundel's occupancy. The aristocratic model of inhabitation had featured a large house, used by a small family and their servants. The school model brought hundreds of people into direct contact with the building. But this intensive use also took a toll. The fabric of the building suffered from the wear and tear of institutional occupation. Maintenance budgets in educational institutions are always stretched thin, and Wardour's elaborate interiors couldn't receive the meticulous care they required. By the time the school closed in 1990, the house was again in poor condition, with significant repairs needed. When Cranborne Chase School closed in 1990, New Wardour Castle faced an uncertain future. The building had already been designated by Historic England as a Grade 1 listed building in 1951, the highest level of protection, recognizing it as a building of exceptional architectural and historical importance. The grounds had been designated Grade 2 Star listed, indicating their significance in the history of landscape design. These designations meant that any future use would have to respect and preserve the building's historic character. In 1992, an investor named Nigel Tuersley purchased the property for under £1 million, a price that seems remarkably low, given the building's scale and significance, but that reflected the enormous costs and challenges associated with converting and maintaining such a building. Tuersley had a vision for transforming Wardour into luxury apartments, creating some of the most exclusive residential addresses in England. For the conversion, Tuersley selected John Pawson, a designer known for his minimalist aesthetic and his sensitive approach to historic buildings. Pawson's work is characterized by extreme simplicity, unadorned surfaces, perfect proportions, and an almost monastic clarity. This might seem an odd choice for a Baroque Palladian palace, but Pawson understood that the building's architecture was so powerful it needed no embellishment. His intervention would be almost invisible, respecting Paine's original design while adapting the building for contemporary residential use. Pawson's first major decision was to eliminate most of the additions made during the school years. The classroom blocks, dormitory extensions, and dining hall addition were demolished, returning the building's exterior to something approximating its original form. Only the most carefully integrated additions were retained. This demolition was expensive, but necessary to restore the building's architectural integrity. The house was then divided into 10 apartments, along with 5 cottages in the grounds. The conversion had to navigate complex challenges. Each apartment needed to function as a self-contained residence with its own kitchen and bathrooms, but these modern requirements had to be integrated without damaging historic fabric. Building regulations required fire safety measures, accessibility features, and modern services, all of which had to be incorporated sensitively. The principal apartment occupied the 2 main floors of the central block, incorporating the rotunda and the original staterooms. This apartment would provide its owners with an experience of living in a historic palace, 8 reception rooms arranged in a circle around the piano nobile at the top of the spectacular rotunda. The rotunda itself, with its 60-foot height rising to a glazed dome supported by 8 composite columns, became the apartment's entrance hall, arguably the most magnificent entrance hall in any private residence in Britain. Other apartments were created in the flanking pavilions and on upper floors of the main block. Each had its own character, some featuring original decorative elements like painted ceilings and marble fireplaces, others occupying spaces that had been less elaborately decorated and that could more easily accommodate contemporary interiors. The conversion respected the chapel, which remained under the ownership of the Wardour Chapel Trust and continued to function as a Catholic parish church. This meant that one portion of the building complex continued to serve its original purpose, maintaining a living connection to the faith that had motivated the building's creation. The grounds were also carefully maintained, including the walled garden with its swimming pool, tennis courts, and the parkland with its carefully composed views of old Wardour Castle. Capability Brown's 18th-century landscape design remained largely intact, a testament to the enduring power of his vision. The apartment conversion was completed to high standards, and the property attracted wealthy buyers seeking unique historic residences. In 2010, the fashion designer Jasper Conran purchased Apartment 1, the principal apartment occupying the central block. Conran was immediately captivated by the rotunda staircase, calling it possibly the best staircase in England, if not the world. For a designer of Conran's sophistication and international experience to make such a claim speaks to the staircase's extraordinary quality. Conran divided his time between Wardour and Venn House, another historic property he owned. He filled Apartment 1 with antiques and artworks, creating interiors that honored the building's history while reflecting his own refined aesthetic. When he sold the apartment in 2020 for £4 million, the price reflected both the property's unique character and the quality of the conversion. The subsequent Christie's auction of the apartment's contents in 2021 attracted international attention, demonstrating the enduring fascination with English country house culture. New Wardour Castle's architectural magnificence has also made it attractive to filmmakers. The building's interiors provide a ready-made setting for period dramas, requiring minimal modification to create convincing historical atmospheres. In 1988, The house was used in filming the television miniseries Firstborn, a science fiction drama about a genetic research program. The house's grand interiors provided suitably imposing settings for scenes set in an elite research facility. More famously, Wardour was used in the filming of Billy Elliot, the 2000 film about a working-class boy in northern England who dreams of becoming a ballet dancer. The contrast between the film's gritty depiction of declining mining communities and Wardour's aristocratic splendor created powerful visual juxtapositions. Scenes set in the Royal Ballet School were filmed at Wardour, the rotunda and staterooms standing in for the elite institution where Billy's talent is nurtured. This cinematic use of Wardour speaks to the building's ability to communicate meaning through its architecture. Directors recognize that Wardour's interiors immediately convey messages about power, tradition, cultural sophistication, and social hierarchy, all without requiring any explanation. The building itself becomes a character in the narrative, shaping how audiences understand the story being told. As we conclude this journey through New Wardour Castle's history, certain themes emerge with particular clarity. First is the theme of survival. The Arundell family survived centuries of religious persecution. Maintaining their faith when doing so cost them fortune and social status. They survived the destruction of their ancestral castle during the Civil War. They survived the financial penalties imposed by a hostile government. And they not only survived, they eventually prospered sufficiently to build one of England's finest Palladian palaces. New Wardour Castle stands as a monument to that survival, a physical embodiment of resilience and faith. Second is the theme of transformation. The building has served many purposes: aristocratic residence, charitable home, boarding school, and now luxury apartments. Each transformation required adaptation, but the building's fundamental architecture proved flexible enough to accommodate these changes while maintaining its essential character. This adaptability ensured the building's survival through the 20th century, when thousands of English country houses were demolished because no economically viable use could be found for them. Third is the theme of cultural continuity. Despite all the transformations, certain elements have remained constant. The chapel continues to serve the Catholic community, just as it has since 1776. The architecture continues to inspire awe in all who experience it. The connection to the past, to the Arundells' vision, to Paine's design genius, to the craftsman who built the house, remains tangible and powerful. New Wardour Castle reminds us that buildings are not static monuments, but living entities that evolve with changing times and needs. The aristocratic world that created New Wardour Castle has vanished. The social structures, the economic systems, the cultural assumptions that made such houses possible and necessary no longer exist. And yet the building endures, adapted to contemporary uses but still fundamentally itself, still capable of moving us with its beauty, still telling the story of the family that built it and the faith that sustained them through centuries of adversity. In an age of rapid change and frequent disposability, there's something profoundly reassuring about New Wardour Castle's survival. It demonstrates that quality endures, that beauty has lasting value, that the vision and craftsmanship of previous generations can continue to enrich our lives centuries later. The rotunda staircase that Jasper Conran called possibly the best in the world continues to sweep upward in perfect symmetrical curves, its glass candle lamps ready to transform the space into a cascade of light, just as they did on the evening of the house's first grand entertainment in 1776. The Corinthian columns still support the coffered dome with its musical instruments, still frame the view upward toward the glazed lantern that admits ever-changing natural light. The chapel's exceptional acoustics continue to amplify music and song during Mass, just as they have for nearly 250 years. These continuities matter. In a world where much is ephemeral, where technologies obsolesce within years, where fashions change with every season, New Wardour Castle stands as a reminder that some things transcend their moment of creation and achieve a timelessness that speaks across generations. The ruins of old Wardour Castle remain visible from New Wardour's windows, just as Henry Arundel intended. That view across the parkland, from palace to ruin, from present to past, encapsulates the full arc of the Arundel family's journey. Destruction and resurrection, loss and redemption, despair and hope. It also reminds us that all human achievements, no matter how magnificent, exist within time and are subject to its ravages. The great palace will someday be a ruin itself, unless careful stewardship preserves it. But for now, New Wardour Castle endures, magnificent and mysterious, a palace built on the ashes of persecution, a monument to faith and resilience, an architectural masterpiece that has outlasted the world that created it and continues to inspire wonder in all who experience it. Its story is unique, but it also speaks to universal human experiences: the desire to create beauty, the need to express faith, the hope that what we build will outlast us and speak to future generations about what we valued, what we believed, and what we hoped to leave behind.